Okie doke.
Good.
Yeah.
Well, hello, everybody. We are back again for another installment of Homiletic 501 or Worship 501 or whatever this is, but you're in the right place nonetheless. It is our distinct pleasure to be with you, and we are glad that your opportunity to grow in the craft of preaching has been enriched by your time with your colleagues and with us. I can speak for my colleagues in saying that we have grown much being with you, even in this strange and modified form that we find ourselves in now. So with that being said, we are picking up at a very interesting and I think critical juncture of the sermon development process. Might I add that I want to make a delineation between sermon as written product and then being the sermon. And so what we're asking and inviting you to do is to be the sermon. And what form allows you to do, which is the topic of our lesson today, it allows you to then embody what it is you're trying to convey. You're structuring and you're forming the energy, you're forming the experience in such a way that equips you to then embody. So that embodiment is being structured on paper to bring that experience to you. And so what form allows you to do is allows you to harness that feeling and harness the impetus of the spirit so that you're able then to do the work that's necessary. So many preachers that I've talked to over the years have not thought much about form for obvious reasons. There's so many other things to think about, i.e., what to say. Am I going to be able to cover the time? Will people listen? Will they be entertained? Will they be edified? It's Saturday night. It's Sunday morning. I'm not finished yet. So there's a lot of other considerations why people have not given much attention to form. But if I'm allowed to be honest with you all, sermon form is at the crux of my sermonic creativity, because what form has allowed me to do over the years that I've preached is giving me an excitement about approaching the biblical text because there's so many ways to do it. So not only has it been a homiletical resource, but it's also been a source of devotion, if you will, because form in many ways inspires a curiosity about why things are the way that they are, which provides me another opportunity to awe and to be able to be moved by the ways in which my faith has shaped me. So it's not sermon form necessarily in terms of how to move the pieces around. That's part of it. But life has form, life has structure. And in order for life to be efficient and to have mission and purpose and to channel that energy in productive ways, it has to be constructed, it has to be engineered, it has to be harnessed and then deployed in ways that allow for its efficient and beneficial usage. And so as we talk about form, this first video or two videos is going to discuss briefly why form is important and our approaches to form. And then the second video will then talk about, actual forms themselves. And I'll talk you through the forms and how to deploy them and some of the strengths and weaknesses and then some practical preaching advice. So to begin our conversation on sermon form, which I think is important, I am curious as to how my colleagues think about or don't necessarily think about in conscious or unconscious ways sermon form. And so I'll ask Professor Turner, how do you think about sermon form as one who preaches to people on a regular basis?
We were talking about this just a little bit before we started recording. And one of the things that I shared is that I will sometimes start my process with form, which is a little bit unusual. We talk about focus statement, what you want to say, and the function statement, what you want to do. And form, it can be a little bit of an afterthought, the piece of how you want to say it. But lots of times I'm aware, because I tend to be a more right-brained, intuitive thinker, I'm aware that what I mostly know is how I want to be with people. And so as I'm approaching the text, the question on my mind is, what is going to let me be authoritative, or what's going to let me be questioning, or what is going to let me be vulnerable, whatever it is at the pastoral moment calls for. And it's interesting that the same text and even sometimes the same focus can really lend itself to a variety of different forms. So it can be the place where you begin. And I'll say that that's been especially true for me when I have been dictated by the physical constraints of where I am preaching. It's sort of funny to realize that architectural form can influence spoken form, but it's very different to preach from, one of those colonial teacup pulpits way up on high to, if you're at a church where you really can't use the pulpit, because there are a lot of churches that might have pulpits that are just not functional. And so that's going to really alter the way I want to present the good news that I have to present that week. Another very practical piece of that, we haven't yet gotten into, maybe some of the sections have the whole question of preaching without notes. There are times when that has to happen for reasons of architecture, honestly. And there are some ways around it, but there are moments that really call for it. And form is essential in those situations. I have a really lousy short-term memory, and form is what allows me to carry through the text. So not only is it a communication tool, it's also a very practical tool. Finally, I'll say that form often will dictate, and I think this might blend towards to what Ruthanna is thinking, but it often dictates the way into the text, how it is that you start from things. There's a woman who does a lot with preaching. She has a business called Backstory Preaching. And she refers to the latch, which is that not necessarily the first thing in your text, but that imaginative way in. And that can often really dictate what form you're going to take. The place that you enter into the maze tells you a little something about which way you're going to go.
Dr. Hook, how do you approach organizing, or how do your sermons find their form?
Yeah, I said to my colleagues before we started recording that I don't think consciously about form all that much. And I think there's sort of a default form that I fall into, which usually is kind of like jumping right into the text and saying, here's something weird about this text. And this is something I often noticed right when I first started. So that first, quote, page of the sermon journal, what is that first thing that seems really weird? Like, why were the bridesmaids, left out when they came back, or, whatever the thing is from your text. And then I will say, okay, so here's this weird thing. And then I usually will say something like, why should we care? And then try to link it early on in the sermon to something that's going on in our lives or in our world. And then I'll proceed to sort of unpack the implications of the text and kind of take people through this journey of discovery, where by the end we see that it matters and that it transforms us. And that is sort of what in Tom Long's book he would call the inductive form, which is an overall category. But Fred Craddock, who is a really eminent homiletician, realized that people more and more don't really listen well to sermons where the point of the sermon is stated right up front. Like, I'm going to talk to you about the mercy and grace of God, and here I'm going to unpack in 3 points or whatever. That style is a more old-fashioned style, which relates to the greater authority that maybe a preacher might have had 50 years, 75, 100 years ago. Now, as he says, Craddock, we are, and the book he wrote is called As One Without Authority. So without that sort of immediate access where people are going to say, oh, here's the preacher, I want to listen, we have to sort of secure a hearing by arousing people's interest in the text and showing early on in the sermon that this matters for their lives. And then we can start to show why that is so. And that's very much the style that Barbara Brown Taylor uses. If you look at her sermons, it's kind of like, here's something really interesting about this text, and I'm going to show you why it matters and why it makes sense. So to me, that's usually the default form that I follow. And I'm very concerned about introduction, like how a sermon starts. When I notice a lot of beginning preachers will sort of eddy around the start, and they won't really start until they're, on their second or third page of the sermon. And often in sections we'll be saying, you know, you don't need that introductory story. You don't need that joke. You don't need whatever that is. Just go straight to what matters in the text. And that form has been more what I have done in recent years. And then in terms of the conclusion, I used to have conclusions that went on and on and on, where I just kept restating what I had already said, like a term paper. You know, tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you told them. Don't do that in sermons. You know, end it sooner than you think you need to, because if you repeat over and over what you've already said, you've lost people. And all of this is about preaching for the ear. You're talking, you know, it's an oral form. It's not a written form. And making that transition is part of learning good sermon form. All right. That's pretty.
I think to add to Ruth Anna's comment, and just to kind of provide a brief overview, sermon form has recently become more of a homiletical discussion. From an ancient perspective, there were a couple of main types. There was like the university sermon, where you kind of took a thought and it became like the origin of the 3 points in the poem sermon, where you took a point, you broke it down, and then you broke those points into subpoints. And then out of that came a style that was a little bit different, but out of that same overarching organization. And so what I would like to relay to you all is that sermon form has evolved as the listener has been more engaged as the focus of homiletics. So with the new homiletic movement, you found people who are asking different questions about what preaching should be. How should preaching engage the listener? How does the listener respond and engage in the call and response way with the preacher? So as homiletics through the new homiletic movement and beyond began to really think about the listener, you saw a proliferation of forms and prospects for what sermons can do in the moment. So some preachers talked about the individual aspects of the sermon, or the move, they call them moves or points. There's different ways in which these designations or segments of the sermons are categorized. Much of that is tied to the function in which that piece serves to the whole. So a person will say, this is a point to my sermon because that sermon is mainly structured in that argumentative style. But if people talk about moves or scenes, again, they're alluding to a different way of making sense and organizing the sermon as a whole. So when we talk about sermon form, we're talking about the way that you're going to take people from start to finish. And that thought about the listener in terms of taking the listener from start to finish and using that start to finish as a means of formation or an extension of formation has been underplayed until recently. So when we think about sermon form, it's important for us to understand also that sermon form is the structure that we build our sermon around. It is the way in which we make sense of the map of our sermon. There are a lot of great sermons that are octopus sermons. They don't really have a skeleton, but they just kind of squish around, and they're able to accomplish their purpose, but people are not able to really put a handle on the material because they don't have the structure. There's a lot of great aspects and a lot of great information, but unfortunately the structure is what people typically remember because the structure is the way in which that sermon is delivered to them. So it's important for us to take seriously what it means to wrestle with sermon form. When I think about sermon form for my preaching, I build my sermons around form. So the text tells me, it gives me a sense of what form might work. So if it's a narrative, or if it's a poem, or if it's wisdom literature, or if it's a letter, the form of the letter or the form of the text gives me a sense of what forms may or may not be helpful. So trying to overlay a narrative form on a text from Proverbs may not necessarily help out what I'm trying to do because it's not a narrative strain that holds that book together. So I'm looking at what is the, if you will, what's the beat of the text? And the beat of the text gives me a sense of how I can accompany what the text is saying with my sermon. So it's akin to how rap is. So there's a beat, and your job is to find a pocket in the beat and just kind of move with it. And so I try to do that with the text. And so the structure gives me a way of approaching that so I can stay in the pocket. And so so if it's a narrative, I don't want to take the narrative and butcher the narrative by putting a strange form on it. I might want to play that narrative out and really engage in the emotions and the colors. But sometimes a form, if I place it on top, or if I tell the sermon what kind of form it should be, then it'll be a good sermon, but I will feel like I cut out parts that could have really given it some life. So much like Ann, I think about form going in, but to Anna's point, once I have the form, it just kind of fills itself in. I don't think about it after that, but it helps to liberate my mind by having a sense of how to approach this thought, which is why I lead in with the sentence, which is why I give you a title first. I give you a title because the title then tells me how to then approach developing that, teasing that, engaging that, referencing that, shading that, and bringing it back at the end to Anna's point about introductions and conclusions. So oftentimes introductions and conclusions are weak because people don't know where they're going in their sermon. And so if you write yourself clear, then you're going to have to go back and then reshape the introduction and conclusion to match the clarity that came in the body. So sometimes you'll see a disjointed sermon because the body's clear, but it seems like the beginning and the end were sandwiched on. And that's because the preacher wasn't able to go back through and sand those introductions and conclusions to match the body, so it's kind of oblong in the way that it's shaped. So in terms of introductions, conclusions, and body, if you take your focus, you take your function in many ways speaks to your form. Because if I'm trying to get you if my verb in the function is for you to understand, then my form should then point to how I'm going to help you to understand. So this is why we ask you to write these things out, because you can literally see a chain between the initial thought until this particular point. So we ask for the claim and the focus and the function, because now the function helps you with your form and the focus helps you fill in the body. But if those things are fuzzy, then it's going to be very difficult to have the concision that you're looking for, and also the crispness and the engagement of the introduction and conclusion. Your introduction is going to be in, and your conclusion is not going to snap because they haven't been set up to do so. So that's why form is important. So some people will say it doesn't matter, just get up and move how the Spirit moves you. But even you getting up and having utterance in that liturgy is an aspect of form, because liturgy is a form of form. So even your freestyle moment is within form. So we're asking you to think about the ways in which form helps to shape not only the theological claim of your sermon, but how form in many ways helps to provide continuity to your leadership as a minister as a whole. So the reason why I'm excited about this aspect of it in terms of talking about form is that once a preacher is comfortable with structure, you're able then to improvise. And so you're able to improvise with confidence at that. One last question before we conclude this aspect. For my colleagues, when you think about sermon form and you want students to engage that thought in the future, what piece of wisdom would you like to impart to them about sermon form, whether it's an anecdote, whether it's a piece of advice, as they begin to think about including this in their repertoire of preaching? I think I would begin by saying, care as much about how you deliver as what you deliver. And the care to share has to match the delivery. And if it doesn't match, you'll get the benefit of the doubt at times, but unfortunately there's going to be a mismatch oftentimes between people's reception and your desire to share. So that would be my piece. Professor Turner, what says ye?
It feels like the pearl of great price that I have to offer. I'm just aware of, this may sound counterintuitive, but if you love writing or if you are a strong writer, that may actually put you at a little bit of a disadvantage in preaching. Just as I think about sermon form, writing and reading are obviously different experiences than hearing and the auditory experience. And, you know, we are primarily, I hope I didn't say this year already, but we're primarily a visual culture, as opposed to many other cultures that are more auditory. People in Shakespeare's time talked about going to hear a play. And so just being aware that when you are writing, you're entering into one kind of artistic process, and to keep in mind that ultimately whatever form you choose, whatever organizational structure, delivery method, whatever it might be, it's going to come back to being primarily an auditory experience for people. And so that can be, it's really challenging if you like writing, if you like that sort of experience, but hold in mind what the end, you know, Sunday morning product is going to be.
Dr. Hook.
All right,
Pearl of
let's
Great
see.
Price.
Pearl of Great Price. Okay, I might do a couple pearls. One is, I do not assume that people care about the text, the Bible, when I get up to preach. So I need to raise the stakes pretty quickly about why this matters. So Dr. Jefferson talked a few weeks ago about the so what. That needs to be pretty clear from the start, because I don't assume that people are automatically going to give me a hearing. So that's one thing. And then I think Tom Long talks about this in the book, that form is really about kind of getting people over certain hurdles of understanding and going along with you. As Dr. Jefferson just said, you're moving people from beginning to end. So be thinking about, like, where are the stumbling blocks for people? Like, let's say you're preaching on divorce, that reading on divorce that comes up. You pretty much have to name it right up front. This is going to be a difficult reading for a lot of people, and here's how I'm going to try to walk you through it. And then you sort of think in the mind of the listener, what's going to get in the way of my buying this, taking this on board, and how I'm going to march people through that. And then the other short piece is just repetition and breadcrumbs, like to let people know where you're going in the sermon, to come back to a phrase, to say, you know, to make signposts, to make things clear as you go, because you're writing for the ear and not for a written. People can't go back and look at what you said before. So really trying to use some rhetorical device to keep people tracking with you is important.
Well, good. You all have been able to glean some of our loose pearls. Hopefully they'll make you a little bit richer in the homiletic venture. But thank you for watching this video. And up next is the nuts and bolts of it. All right.